What happens when a society gets, exactly what it wants? Like they achieve a total freedom, they receive this massive generation-defining promise, and then they completely self-destruct.
Yeah, we have this really modern, I guess, optimistic assumption today.
Right.
We think that if you just remove all the constraints, if you just give people their freedom and the resources they need, they'll naturally default to harmony.
Like they'll just naturally be virtuous.
Exactly. But today, we are looking at an ancient text that acts as this terrifyingly accurate autopsy of human nature.
A document that argues the exact opposite of that modern assumption.
Oh, entirely the opposite.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're taking you into a text that reads, well, less like a dusty history book and way more like an unnerving psychological diagnosis.
A diagnosis of why communities, leaders, and even you and I as individuals repeatedly fall into the same toxic traps.
The traps we absolutely swore we would avoid. We are unpacking a pretty fascinating stack of sources for you today.
We've got a comprehensive document titled The Cycle of Sin and Deliverance by Chris R. Velasquez.
Plus some incredibly detailed visual infographics that break down the biblical book of Judges. And the mission today is to figure out what this ancient blueprint says about us right now.
So to start, the setting for this text is it's crucial to understanding the psychology of everything that follows.
Let's set the stage for everyone.
Right. So the book of Judges takes place in this very specific, incredibly volatile window of history. It happens right after the Israelites receive the Promised Land.
Which was the ultimate climax of their history up to this point.
Exactly. This was Joshua's gift to them, the fulfillment of a promise made generations prior.
So they have the land, they have the freedom, but, and this is key, they do not yet have a centralized king.
Yeah, it is a bizarre transitional era. The sources call it a societal liminal space.
Which is just a fancy way of saying they were in the messy middle. The sources describe it as this raw, honest look at what happens when God's rule is treated as optional.
When holiness becomes completely negotiable.
Right, and obedience is just considered like a temporary phase.
Yeah.
You achieve the goal, you get the land, and then you just you drift.
And that drift is the central theme here. It's what makes this ancient text about, Middle Eastern tribal conflicts universally relevant for anyone listening today.
Because the truth the text demonstrates is that possessing a promise is not the same thing as possessing faithfulness.
Not at all. I mean, external blessings, getting the land, getting the promotion, finally securing that relationship you wanted, they do absolutely nothing to cure internal corruption.
Well, yeah. You can change the geography, you can change the political structure all you want.
But if the internal compass is broken, the society will inevitably fracture.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the entire document from Velasquez and those infographics we're looking at, they're built around this recurring pattern.
It's an anatomy of a downward trajectory.
Yeah, the text lays it out in this sequence.
Yeah.
Step 1, Israel forgets God and does evil.
Then step 2, oppression comes as God hands them over to their enemies.
All right, then step 3, in their distress, the people cry out.
Step 4, God responds by raising up a deliverer, a judge.
Step 5, deliverance is achieved. Step 6, the land experiences a period of rest.
And then the absolute gut punch, step 7, they relapse.
But the sources are incredibly deliberate in noting that this isn't just a reset to zero, right?
No. And the infographics make a brilliant visual distinction here. We're so conditioned to think of patterns as circles.
Like a wheel turning and coming back to the exact same starting point.
Exactly. But Judges, however, is a spiral downward.
A spiral.
Right. Each time the community goes through these steps, the baseline drops. The floor falls out just a little bit more.
So they don't end up where they started, they end up worse.
Much worse. The text explicitly tells us that each cycle is worse than the last, eventually ending in complete chaos.
We're talking tribal civil war, total moral inversion.
The phrase from the text that captures this perfectly is that sin has inertia.
Sin has inertia. That is such a heavy concept.
It is. It means that left to themselves, humans do not stabilize. They descend.
It's like watching a friend trapped in a toxic relationship or maybe a destructive habit.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. They hit rock bottom, they beg for help, you bail them out, you help them get their act together.
And they behave for a month.
Yeah, everything seems peaceful. The land has rest, as the text says. And then they go right back to it.
But this time, they've burned more bridges, the debt is higher, the danger is worse.
Exactly. So how does an ancient tribal cycle serve as a spiritual anatomy for those kinds of modern habits for us today?
Well, it serves as an anatomy because it isolates the exact mechanism of human drift.
Okay, break that down for us.
So by the time we reach Judges, the Israelites have inherited everything. They have a covenant, a law, a land, and the living memory of being delivered from slavery in Egypt.
They have all the advantages.
But they still carry disordered desires. The external environment has been perfected. They are free in a land flowing with milk and honey.
But their internal reality hasn't caught up at all.
Right. The root of human rebellion, stemming all the way back to the fall in Genesis, it hasn't been erased.
So the document notes that in a post-Genesis 3 world, rebellion just becomes habitual unless it is actively resisted.
Actively. And once rebellion becomes normalized in a culture, spiritual amnesia follows right behind it.
Spiritual amnesia.
Yeah, the initial shock of doing something wrong just fades. The conscience sears, and the abnormal becomes the standard.
Which means the rock bottom in this spiral isn't just a run of bad luck or some historical circumstance.
No, not according to the sources. It's a deliberate response.
The text frames the oppression of Israel, that's step 2 in the downward spiral, not as random cruelty from neighboring tribes.
And not as arbitrary scourges of war either.
Right, but as God's intentional covenant discipline.
The language used in the text is incredibly severe here. It says God sells his people into the hands of their enemies.
He sells them. That is intense.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to understand the mechanics of an ancient covenant.
Because it wasn't just like a polite handshake, right?
No, or a casual agreement. It was a binding life and death treaty. Israel was redeemed and set apart to live as a holy, distinct people.
And obedience to this treaty would bring flourishing, but rebellion would invoke the agreed-upon curses.
Which explicitly included discipline. Therefore, the oppression they face from surrounding nations is highly morally charged.
It is the downstream direct effect of their own covenant betrayal.
Exactly. The external enemies are essentially acting as instruments of God's internal discipline.
Okay, wait, I need to push back on this a little bit, because I know you, the listener, are probably tripping over this concept right now.
Sure, let's hear it.
If God is supposed to be perfectly merciful and loving, how is handing people over to brutal, violent external empires an act of love?
It's a fair question.
Right. How do we reconcile severe, crushing judgment with a loving God? Because on the surface, selling your people to oppressors sounds like abandonment, not discipline.
Yeah, this raises a really important question about the paradox of painful mercy.
Painful mercy.
The document explains that God's judgment in Judges is strictly disciplinary. It's not merely punitive.
Okay, so what's the difference there?
Well, if the goal was simply punishment, or if God had truly abandoned them, the easiest thing to do would be to do absolutely nothing.
Just leave them alone.
Exactly. He could just let them assimilate, he could let them intermarry, adopt Canaanite practices, and just quietly disappear into the surrounding culture.
Completely losing their distinct identity.
Right, and they're calling to be a light to the world. Ignoring them, letting them comfortably destroy themselves, that would be true abandonment.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It's like tackling a kid who is running blindly into traffic.
Yes, perfect example.
It hurts. They scrape their knees, they might even break an arm on the pavement, but you introduce a temporary, immediate pain to prevent their absolute destruction.
You don't just gently whisper, "I hope you find your way," while a truck is barreling down the road.
No, you act decisively, even if it causes some pain.
And taking that a step further, the specific pain of the oppression in Judges is highly calculated to expose the absolute futility of their choices.
How so?
When Israel decides they want to worship the gods of the surrounding nations, the gods of the Canaanites, the Midianites, the Philistines, God effectively removes his protection.
He just steps back.
He steps back and says, "You want to serve their gods. Let's see what life is actually like under their rule."
Wow. So the pain is meant to shatter the illusion that these false gods offer a better life.
Exactly. It is designed to bring them to their senses. It is designed to make them cry out for help.
Which leads directly into the next phase of the spiral.
The pain works.
It does. It gets so bad that the people finally scream for rescue. But here is where the source document introduces perhaps the most devastating psychological insight in the entire text.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
It makes this vital distinction. Crying out is not always repentance.
This is a profound pastoral and psychological truth that the sources highlight. We tend to conflate distress with repentance.
We really do.
When the Israelites cry out in Judges, they are doing so because they are being crushed by the weight of their oppressors.
They are in physical and societal agony.
But they are not necessarily crying out because their hearts are transformed.
Or because they feel sorrow for betraying their covenant.
Right. They are crying out because they hate the consequences of their sin, not the sin itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about how this maps onto human behavior today.
Oh, it maps perfectly.
It's like taking painkillers for a shattered ankle and then going for a jog.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
You've stopped the immediate distress, you don't feel the agony, but you are actively destroying the bone. You treat the symptom, but completely ignore the root cause.
Which fundamentally changes how we view their pleas for help. I mean, people often want to be delivered from the pain that their rebellion causes, but they do not want to be delivered from the rebellion itself.
Right, they want the financial ruin to stop.
They want the marriage to stop hurting, the hangover to go away.
But they have absolutely no intention of changing the behaviors that led to those outcomes.
Precisely. They want relief from the consequences without wanting the God who brings the consequences. They want the rescue, but they reject the rule.
So they are essentially treating God like an ATM for crisis management.
Yes, a cosmic vending machine.
You punch in the code of distress, get the withdrawal of deliverance, and then walk away until you're bankrupt again.
And the sources emphasize that this is exactly why external deliverance never secures lasting faithfulness.
Because the heart remains unchanged.
If the internal desires are still disordered, the moment the pressure is off, the moment the text says the land had rest, the people immediately revert.
Back to the very idols that enslaved them in the first place.
The distress produced desperation, sure, but it completely failed to produce holiness.
Which brings us to the engine of the entire cycle. What is actually driving this massive destructive machine?
If crying out doesn't fix it, what is the root cause?
Right. The sources identify two main intertwined fuels: idolatry and generational amnesia.
And the document points specifically to a chilling passage early in the book, Judges chapter 2, verses 10 through 13.
Yeah, it notes that a whole generation arose that, quote, did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel.
Which is wild. How does an entire nation just forget the parting of the Red Sea?
How do you forget the manna from heaven? Or the walls of Jericho falling down?
Well, the text isn't suggesting a literal historical wiping of the archives.
It's not like they lost the scrolls or the raw data of their history.
No, it's that they lost the living memory. In biblical terms, knowing isn't about cognitive trivia. It's about intimate relational loyalty.
Oh, that makes sense.
The generation that personally walked through the parted waters of the Jordan, the generation that felt the terror and awe of God's presence, they passed away.
And the next generation heard the stories, but treated them merely as, like, folklore.
Exactly. The historical facts were present, but the covenant weight, the awe, the gratitude, the binding loyalty, it just evaporated.
I keep thinking about this, like generational wealth in a family business.
How's
Well, the first generation builds the company from absolutely nothing. They sleep on the factory floor, they sacrifice their health, they know the bloody cost of every single dollar.
right? They lived the struggle.
Exactly. Then the second generation grows up seeing that hard work. They enjoy the wealth, but they are slightly insulated from the initial existential struggle.
And then the third generation arrives.
Yes, they've only ever known luxury. They have absolutely no muscle memory of the foundation, no visceral connection to the sacrifice.
And because they don't value the foundation, they squander the entire fortune in a decade.
That captures the mechanism of spiritual amnesia perfectly.
It really does. When you lose the visceral connection to the foundation, you inevitably look for something else to stand on.
For Israel, forgetting God's past faithfulness created this huge spiritual vacuum.
Which directly led to serving other gods. The text specifically calls out the Baals and the Ashtaroth.
Let's hover on that word idolatry for a moment. Because I think a lot of people hear that word and immediately picture ancient, uneducated people bowing down to literal golden statues in the desert.
Right, and they think, well, I don't carve statues, so I'm immune to this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the sources are clear that idolatry here is far more insidious.
The expert analysis in Velazquez's document defines idolatry not just as a religious error, but as a whole life disorder.
A whole life disorder.
It is a fundamental orientation of the heart. I mean, the Baals and Ashtaroth were not just statues.
What were they?
They represented forces of fertility, weather, agricultural success, and war. They were the gods of the Canaanite economy and security.
Oh, wow. So to worship them meant compromising with the surrounding culture's methods of achieving success.
Precisely. It meant engaging in the moral, ethical, and often highly transactional and exploitative practices of the Canaanites just to secure a good harvest or a military victory.
So it's fundamentally about what you trust to keep you safe and make you prosperous.
Yes.
It's tying your ultimate security to something created rather than the creator.
And the sources map out the devastating sociological progression of this misplaced trust. Because worship shapes ethics.
Worship shapes ethics.
What a society reveres ultimately dictates how that society behaves. Corrupted worship, trusting in transactional gods of power and fertility, inevitably leads to corrupted ethics.
People start viewing each other transactionally.
Exactly. And when ethics are corrupted, the fabric of the community unravels. You see a rise in social injustice, betrayal, violence.
And a fractured, unraveled community is utterly defenseless.
It just invites external oppression.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of destruction. You put the ultimate weight of your soul's happiness on, say, a career, a political ideology, or a relationship.
Things the text would argue are created things.
Right. And they eventually collapse because they were never engineered to bear that much weight.
And when they collapse, they crush you. The spiritual logic of Judges is unforgiving in this regard.
What is worshipped shapes what is loved, what is feared, what is normalized, and what is ultimately permitted in a society.
Exactly.
So we have a society that has totally unraveled. They've forgotten their foundation. They are worshiping the toxic systems of their neighbors. The floor drops out. They are brutally oppressed, and they cry out in sheer desperate pain.
And God, in this baffling display of patience, still responds.
He graciously sends help. He raises a deliverer. But the help he sends is shockingly, almost aggressively, imperfect.
Oh, they are a mess.
Let's dig into these anti-heroes. The infographics list some of the most notable judges, and they are a far cry from polished saints.
The judges are the designated deliverers, but they are incredibly complex, deeply flawed instruments.
The text really forces the reader to confront their moral ambiguity.
It does. If we look at the progression outlined in the sources, we see the downward spiral reflected not just in the people, but in the quality of the leaders themselves.
Let's walk through that roster. We start with Othniel. He's the first judge mentioned, and he frees Israel from Mesopotamian oppression.
And he actually seems like a fairly solid, straightforward leader.
Right. Othniel serves as the baseline. He is the template of what a judge is supposed to be.
The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. He acts decisively. He goes to war. He secures deliverance. And the land has rest for 40 years.
There is no major moral failure recorded about him.
But as we move chronologically down the spiral, the leaders become increasingly compromised.
Okay, next major narrative is Deborah, who partners with Barak. She's a prophetess and a leader, which is fascinating in itself.
And they manage to defeat the Canaanite armies.
Yeah, Deborah is a strong, faithful figure whom God uses mightily. But the inclusion of Barak introduces the first major cracks in leadership.
Exactly. Barak is the military commander, but when he's called to fight, he is intensely hesitant.
He demands that Deborah go with him into battle.
Right, effectively saying he won't trust God's command unless he has human reassurance standing right next to him.
And because of his lack of independent faith, the glory of the final victory is handed over to a woman named Jael, rather than Barak himself.
The victory is massive, but the human leadership is shown to be faltering in its faith.
Okay, but surely God corrects this trajectory with the next leader.
Yeah.
But then we read this section on Gideon.
Oh, Gideon.
God calls Gideon to deliver Israel from the massive armies of the Midianites. And where is Gideon when this divine call comes?
He is literally hiding in a wine press.
Hiding? How does a guy paralyzed by fear become a divine deliverer?
Well, Gideon's psychological profile is deeply rooted in anxiety and a desperate need for control. Even after God speaks to him, he demands signs.
The famous fleece?
Yes, he lays out a fleece of wool, asking God to make it wet while the ground is dry, and then the next night asking God to make the ground wet while the fleece is dry.
We often romanticize the fleece as a legitimate way to discern God's will today.
But the text presents it as a glaring lack of trust. Gideon is testing God because he is terrified.
He needs empirical data before he will step out in faith.
Precisely. And God actually humors him, stripping his massive army down to just 300 men.
To prove that the coming victory is entirely by divine power, not Gideon's military strategy.
And Gideon wins. But the tragedy of Gideon is what happens the moment the battle is over.
This is the part that always gets me.
He collects the gold jewelry plundered from the enemy and crafts a golden ephod, a priestly garment.
And the text says this ephod became a snare to him and to all Israel who, quote, whored after it.
He literally uses the spoils of a divine victory to set up a rival idol,
Dragging the people right back into the very idolatry he just saved them from.
It is mind-boggling cognitive dissonance.
He defeats the physical enemy, but immediately surrenders to the spiritual one. And the spiral just accelerates from there. We hit Jephthah.
Yeah, the infographic describes him as a valiant leader, but notes he makes a rash vow with tragic
And
results.
tragic feels like a massive understatement here.
Jephthah's story is one of the darkest in the entire biblical narrative. Sociologically, he is an outcast.
He's the son of a prostitute, driven away by his legitimate brothers, living as a bandit leader.
When the Ammonites threaten the region, the elders of his tribe realize they need a warlord.
So they beg him to return and lead them.
Jephthah agrees, but he brings deep psychological baggage and a highly corrupted theology into his leadership.
Before going into battle, he is so desperate to secure victory and solidify his newfound status that he tries to negotiate with God.
He makes a vow. If you give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering.
Which is horrifying,
Huh.
because when he returns victorious, it's not a prized animal that runs out of the house.
No, it's his only child, his daughter.
And this reveals the sheer depth of the internal rot. How did Canaanite theology infiltrate his mind so completely?
Well, the surrounding nations worship deities like Chemosh and Molech, gods who demanded child sacrifice in exchange for military victory.
So Jephthah fundamentally misunderstands who Yahweh is.
He treats the God of Israel like a local Canaanite deity who needs to be bribed with human blood to guarantee success.
Which is something the Torah explicitly calls an abomination.
Right. He wins the external battle against the Ammonites, but his internal theology is so poisoned by the culture that he destroys his own lineage.
He achieves the political deliverance, but the moral center is completely dead. And then at the very bottom of the spiral, we get the most famous judge of all, Samson.
The guy with the legendary super strength and the long hair.
The text summarizes him as called but compromised.
Samson is a walking contradiction, a chaotic mess of squandered potential. From birth, he is placed under the Nazirite vow.
He is supposed to be uniquely set apart for God's purposes, abstaining from alcohol, avoiding dead bodies, and never cutting his hair.
But Samson treats his calling with utter contempt. He breaks almost every restriction placed upon him.
He is driven entirely by his appetites, lust, sudden anger, and petty violent revenge.
He seeks out Philistine women, he sleeps with prostitutes, and he constantly flirts with disaster.
Playing a game of chicken with his own divine gift until Delilah finally extracts his secret and betrays him.
He's like a microcosm of Israel itself. Given every possible advantage, completely set apart by God, but entirely compromised by a desire to assimilate with the very people oppressing him.
That is the profound tragedy of Samson.
God still uses his chaotic, violent outbursts to begin disrupting the Philistine oppression, but Samson's life ends in darkness.
He dies a prisoner, eyes gouged out, mocked in the temple of a false god, ultimately bringing the roof down on himself and his enemies in a final act of suicidal revenge.
It's just devastating.
Okay, I have to jump in here because the logic of this is staggering.
Go for it.
If God is orchestrating this overarching narrative of rescue, why use such profoundly flawed people?
That's the big question.
Right. Why empower a man who makes a horrific vow like Jephthah, or a man as reckless and morally bankrupt as Samson? Wouldn't sending perfect, shining examples of virtue inspire the Israelites to finally stay on the right track?
You'd think so.
Why doesn't God just send a flawless leader to model the correct behavior?
What is fascinating here is that the author of Judges is making a highly intentional architectural choice with these narratives.
Okay.
The text is actively dismantling our human tendency towards simplistic hero worship. The judges are presented as instruments, not as saviors.
So they're tools in the toolbox, but they're absolutely not the carpenter.
Exactly, and the sources drive this point home. If God had sent a perfect human hero, the Israelites, and we as the readers, would draw the wrong conclusion.
We would conclude that the ultimate answer to our societal and personal decay is simply finding a better human leader.
We would think, if we just elect the right politician, if we just hire the right CEO, if we just find a charismatic enough pastor, everything will be permanently fixed.
Wow, yeah. By utilizing leaders who are deeply, glaringly compromised, the text proves that humanity cannot deliver itself.
Even the individuals uniquely empowered by the Spirit of God are still infected by the fall.
Human leadership, no matter how gifted, is fundamentally insufficient to cure the root disease.
It creates this massive, agonizing theological tension.
It creates a deep, unquenchable hunger. You read through the book of Judges, and by the time you reach the end of Samson's story, you are exhausted.
You are left crying out, is this the best we have? A coward, a man who sacrifices his daughter, and a violent womanizer.
We need something profoundly better than this.
The victories these judges secure are partial and strictly temporary. They buy a few decades of political peace, but they cannot change the hearts of the people.
And they can't even master their own darkest desires.
The entire book points to a desperate, screaming need for a truly righteous king.
And this deep need for a better king isn't just an isolated theme floating around in this one chaotic book.
No, it's actually a crucial puzzle piece in the entire grand narrative of the Bible.
Let's zoom way out for a second. The sources provide this incredible timeline that traces the overarching biblical storyline, and I want us to map the chaos of Judges onto it to see the full picture.
This is where the theological framework becomes really cohesive.
Walk us through it.
The document traces the biblical narrative through distinct, sweeping epochs. It moves from eternity to creation, from creation to the fall, from the fall to the establishment of the covenant,
From the covenant to redemption, from redemption to kingdom, from kingdom to exile.
from exile to restoration, from restoration to the Messiah, and finally, from judgment to new creation.
Let's walk through that sequence briefly. We start with creation humanity living under God's perfect, ordered rule in unbroken communion.
Then the fall happens. Sin enters, human desires become fiercely disordered, and rebellion becomes the default setting.
God responds with the covenant. He makes a promise to Abraham to form a distinct people.
Then comes redemption. God violently delivers them from slavery in Egypt during the Exodus, brings them through the wilderness, and under Joshua, brings them into the Promised Land.
That's where the era of redemption reaches its climax. So where exactly does the book of Judges fit into this massive historical sequence?
Judges operates as the turbulent transition between the epic of redemption and the epic of the kingdom.
The document describes this specific era as a kingdom in crisis.
Yes, it vividly, painfully demonstrates the absolute necessity of the next step.
The author of Judges hammers this point home with a repeated, haunting refrain that echoes through the darkest chapters of the book.
In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You know, we hear a phrase like that today, and in our modern context, it almost sounds like a utopian slogan for liberation.
It sounds great, doesn't it?
You do you, live your truth, follow your heart.
But the text is arguing that when everyone acts as their own ultimate moral authority, the result isn't a utopia of freedom and self-expression.
The result is absolute, unmitigated carnage.
It is the definition of societal chaos. That phrase is not just political commentary pointing out the lack of a monarch. It is deep theological commentary.
The sources emphasize that without a settled, internalized consciousness of divine rule, a society inevitably fragments into competing factions of self-interest.
And Velocis's document uses a really striking phrase to describe this era. It calls the Book of Judges exile in miniature, or exile before Babylon.
What does exile in miniature mean? I mean, they are sitting right in the middle of the Promised Land.
They haven't been conquered and dragged off to Babylon yet.
Right, how can they be in exile if they possess the geography?
Because the text is teaching us that exile begins in the heart long before it happens on a map.
Wow.
They are physically occupying the land flowing with milk and honey, but spiritually and morally, they are entirely alienated from God.
They are living exactly like the Canaanites they were supposed to drive out.
They have displaced themselves from their true calling as a holy nation. They are exiles in their own homes.
Which just devastatingly proves that external structures, having the right laws written down, being in the perfect geographic environment, possessing the promised land, are utterly useless without internal renewal.
The law, the covenant they received at Sinai, wasn't a magic talisman against rebellion.
It could tell them what to do, but it couldn't give them the power or the desire to actually do it.
And that reality is what previews the necessity of a new covenant later in the biblical narrative.
The Old Covenant was an incredible diagnostic tool. It could point out the flaws with perfect precision. It could illuminate the illness.
But it contained no cure for the human heart.
Judges forces the reader to the agonizing realization that a new political arrangement or a new set of laws will never save us.
We don't just need a king to manage our borders. We need a king who has the power to actually rewrite our desires.
Having seen this grand historical picture, this massive sweeping timeline of failure and longing, we have to bring this down to the ground.
Because this ancient blueprint isn't just history. It applies directly to your everyday reality right now.
We've spent all this time diagnosing the historical illness, but how do we actually treat it today?
The sources offer some incredibly practical implications for breaking this downward spiral.
Let's start at the individual level. For anyone listening to this, The text offers a clear directive.
Watch your heart, remember God's works, and reject idols early.
Because the narrative of Judges warns us that individuals and communities do not usually abandon their core convictions overnight in one dramatic moment.
No, it is a slow, imperceptible fade. They gradually forget. They compromise on small things.
They normalize a little bit of deviance here, a little bit of syncretism there.
It's that generational amnesia we talked about, the loss of the living memory.
Precisely. And the defense against that amnesia is active, aggressive remembrance.
The sources note that practices like reading scripture, engaging in prayer, and consistently gathering with a community are not meant to be like decorative practices.
They are not religious hobbies.
No, they are critical, anti-forgetting practices. They are designed to keep the living memory of God's faithfulness so vivid and immediate that false idols cannot easily take root in the imagination.
What about for people leading organizations? Pastors, CEOs, parents leading a household?
For leaders, the warning from Judges is stark and uncompromising. Aim for deep transformation, not just temporary relief.
A leader's job is not just to stabilize symptoms or help people feel better about their destructive choices.
Leaders must address the root idolatry. And perhaps most importantly, leaders must violently reject hero worship.
The church, or any healthy community, does not need personality-driven deliverers who make the people dependent on them.
Exactly. It needs faithful leaders who constantly point past themselves to the true deliverer. The book shows us that unfaithful, ego-driven leadership just accelerates societal decline.
And for families, the document places a huge emphasis on that generational baton pass.
It states, children must not merely inherit a religious environment, they must be taught the deeds of God.
You can't just take your kids to a building and assume they will absorb a worldview through osmosis.
Memory must be deliberate. The historical foundation must be explicitly narrated and modeled, otherwise the third generation squanders the inheritance.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize it? We've got these practical steps: remembering, aiming for transformation, teaching the next generation.
But the sources make it painfully clear that we cannot just try harder.
We can't white-knuckle our way out of this spiral.
The most common misunderstanding, according to the document, is relying on self-reliance.
Thinking that if we just build a better system, or if we just exert more self-discipline, we can fix the human condition.
Trusting in human leaders, political systems, or our own sheer willpower is exactly what perpetuated the cycle in Judges.
The document asserts that the cycle is only permanently broken through the true King, Jesus Christ.
Let's get into the mechanics of that. How exactly does the gospel break a cycle that centuries of human willpower, military victory, and strict laws could not?
It goes back to the fundamental difference between treating the symptom and curing the root.
The flawed judges of the Old Testament delivered Israel from external oppression. They treated the symptom.
Christ delivers humanity from sin itself. He eradicates the root.
The gospel breaks the cycle not by demanding stronger human resolve, but through the mechanism of substitution.
The text points to the cross as the place where God's severe judgment and his infinite mercy finally intersect.
God does not ignore the rebellion. He doesn't sweep the broken covenant under the rug, but he absorbs the discipline himself in the person of Christ.
So instead of the people being sold into the hands of their enemies to pay the physical price for their betrayal,
Christ willingly pays the ultimate price on their behalf.
and then, crucially, the deliverance doesn't stop at just clearing the debt.
There is the transformative gift of the Holy Spirit.
The infographic quotes a prophetic promise from Ezekiel 36.26, which is the ultimate answer to the book of Judges.
I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh.
That right there is the cure to the internal corruption. That is what fixes the broken compass.
The ancient judges could only offer temporary relief, a few decades of rest before the floor fell out again.
But Christ offers permanent rest, eternal reconciliation, and a fundamentally new heart that actually possesses the internal desire to obey.
He doesn't just interrupt the downward spiral, he permanently ends it.
What an absolute gauntlet of a journey we've been on today.
It really is.
We started by looking at this murky, complex diagnostic landscape of human behavior, and we uncovered this brutally honest downward spiral of sin that infects every society.
We unpacked the shocking, painful mercy of God's discipline, exploring how he sometimes hands us over to our chosen idols to vividly demonstrate how empty and destructive they actually are.
We dissected the psychological difference between merely crying out to stop the pain of consequences versus experiencing true heart-level repentance.
We examine the twin engines of societal collapse, spiritual amnesia, and whole life idolatry, and how they unravel a community from the inside out.
We looked closely at the anti-heroes, how even the greatest human leaders are hopelessly flawed, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that humanity lacks the capacity to save itself.
And finally, we saw how all this historical chaos points directly to the ultimate need for a perfect king, one who refuses to just manage our symptoms but actually steps in to replace our hearts entirely.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Oh, this is a good one.
The text shows us again and again that Israel kept looking to these flawed temporary judges to save them from their immediate crises, only to fall right back into the spiral the second the pressure was off.
If human hearts haven't fundamentally changed since ancient times, and the evidence suggests they haven't, who or what are the modern judges in your life?
Maybe it's a politician you are convinced will finally fix the country.
Maybe it's a new piece of technology, a charismatic self-help guru entering into a new relationship, or finally hitting that specific financial milestone.
What created thing are you secretly relying on to deliver you today? And when that temporary judge inevitably fails to hold the weight of your soul, as they all eventually do, will you just cry out for a new temporary fix, repeating the cycle?
Or will you finally look to the true king who can actually change your heart from the inside out?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep connecting the dots.